Okay, great. So welcome again, everyone. We've given it 2 minutes after the scheduled time that we were meant to start, 11 o'clock South African time. I think everyone that is online now was online last week again. So you would have heard the introduction when I gave the brief introduction of Bev. And this really is a great interest of hers, though by profession she's an optometrist. But you would have gathered, and I got such wonderful feedback from last week, that the passion for the subject really comes through the presentation. And without further delay, it gives me such great pleasure to ask Bev to present the second talk in this three-part series. So thanks again, Bev.
It's an absolute pleasure. It's lovely to be here again. And I'm very passionate about Jewish history, so I hope that that does come out. I'm passionate about optometry too, but Jewish history is like my pet subject. So tonight we are going to be talking about the journey east. So I don't know if you remember last week, where those of you, I hope, heard last week, where we finished off where there had just been the trauma of the Crusades, followed by the bubonic plague. And that resulted in huge amounts of devastation in the Jewish communities in the lands of the traditional lands of Ashkenaz, which was around the Rhineland, France, so sort of between, in the Rhone Valley, between the Rhone and the Rhine. That was the traditional lands of Ashkenaz, and the trauma of the Crusades, and then following that, the bubonic plague in the mid 1300s caused waves and waves of anti-Semitism, pogrom type experiences, and violence against Jews, a huge rise in Germanic anti-Semitism, Germanic medieval anti-Semitism, and this resulted in Jews needing to move. So we have massive waves of Jewish immigration from the traditional lands of Ashkenaz over to the east. So I'm going to share, hopefully, the screen here. There we go. So now tonight we're going to be talking about the journey east. If you see me looking to my right, it's not because I'm reading notes. It's because I'm looking at all of you. It's easier for me to look at people when I talk, so I can see you. I can see you all there, and instead of right in the middle, which is actually, you know, my PowerPoint. So let's just have a look where the Jews went. So you can see, if you look at this map, I don't know if you can see me pointing with my little pointer here, but basically the Jews are coming from Germany, the traditional lands of Ashkenaz, and they're moving in these years. You can see 1096 was the year of the First Crusade, when they hit the Rhineland and caused all that destruction to the Jewish communities of what we call Shum, Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. So that you can see Jews moving east. You can see at different times coming from Austria, coming from Hungary. They're all moving in that direction. Now, why are they moving in that direction? You know, what made them move east? And this was literally because if you try and think back to, you know, history from a long time ago, you'll know that the Mongol invasions that came in the 1200s really devastated Central Europe, like completely devastated Central Europe, and Central Europe needed to rebuild. And when they rebuilt, they invited, so the king of Poland invited Jews to come, as well as Germans, to come and help resettle the land and reestablish commerce in the land of Poland. So when we're talking about Poland, I'm also talking about Lithuania. So a lot of what I say tonight when I say Poland is because you're going to hear very soon that Poland and Lithuania form one giant big country called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. That becomes one massive country in 1569 with the Union of Lublin. So often when I say Poland, I'm also at the time referring to Lithuania. Okay, so initially we have the kings of Poland. Lithuania was never it was never a kingdom. Poland was a kingdom. Lithuania was a duchy, so it had a duke, whereas Poland had a king. So in Poland in 1264, we have a king called, it's actually not a king, we have a duke called Duke Boleslav IV. We have him inviting Jews to come into Poland, and he creates a document called the Statute of Kalej, and that statute gives privileges to the Jews. So I mean, it was sort of a no-brainer, honestly, to move to the east, because things were really not good in Ashkenaz, they were not good in Germany, and things looked really appealing in the east. So you know, in Poland, Jews were offered under this thing called Magdeburg Recht, so Magdeburg law. They were offered a whole bunch of privileges. They could have privileges in certain trades. They could decide where they wanted to live. They could have monopolies over certain trades. And of course, once Duke Boleslav has granted the statute, it also comes with legal documentation that says, look, the Jews are allowed to live here and they're a protected people. Now, I mean, so if you were living, you know, in Germany, why on earth would you not go to Poland? Obviously, it's much more rural and it's much less fancy, but you're protected by law, which in the Middle Ages, honestly, just didn't happen. The Jews in Germany and France and England had no rights, no law protecting them, absolutely nothing at all. So here there's law. And then in 1334, there was a very great king called Casimir the Great, Casimir III, and he ratifies the Statute of Kalej and he adds to it. And he's sort of the famous one, you know, when people go, you know, who was the king that, you know, that led all the Jews into Poland, people seem to remember Casimir the Great, who was a very sort of enlightened, even though the Enlightenment hadn't happened, but he was an enlightened king. And he invited more and more Jews to come in. So if you look at that map, you'll see the years that Jews are coming into Poland, sort of, you know, ranges over a 400-year period with Jews coming into Poland and also coming into Lithuania. Now, Lithuania a little bit later as a country lets Jews in with laws and with rights. So there's a man called the Grand Duke Vytautas. Vytautas also invites Jews into Lithuania and gives them laws very, very similar to what Boleslav had provided. So it's sort of a statute of rights, where he's sort of giving them, like, not citizenship, but he's calling them like sort of like citizens of the place. They're allowed to live there, they've got permission, and they've also got protection from the king. So actually the Jews living in Poland and Lithuania until the 1600s, mid-1600s, don't really run into any sort of anti-Semitic problems that's happening all around the world. It's sort of a peaceful place generally for Jews to live. As I said before, simple, but peaceful. And after everything that the Jews had experienced in the Middle Ages, peaceful was pretty much, you know, what they wanted. So it also became much more attractive after 1453, when you've got the fall of Constantinople, and now you've got Turks in what was the Byzantine Empire, which has now become the Ottoman Empire. Jews had a very good connection with other Jews from other countries, and we spoke about this before. If you want to trade with another country, you need people that can speak the language of people in the other country and can communicate with them, can trade with them. And of course, Jews, you know, even if you don't know a Jew, you're always going to be more likely to be able to communicate with them. You've got things in common, and communities sort of helped each other along the way. And so once the Ottoman Empire becomes established, the Jews in the Ottoman Empire have got now trade relations with the Jews in Poland. And so it became much more attractive for Jews to move to southern Poland, which was then trading the Crimea, and then trading also with Constantinople or Istanbul. And of course, the Spanish Inquisition and then expulsion happens in 1492. So you've got Sephardi Jews also moving of course, to all over the show, but moving to Istanbul as well, and all over the Ottoman Empire. They were quite safe there, but also moving into Poland, and some also moving to Lithuania. And in fact, the Jews thought Poland was so great that they called it Polin, which means here we will rest, here we shall rest. We'll rest or we'll reside, until we have to move on to green pastures, or until we have to move, or until we can move to Israel. So it was sort of, it was considered for Jews just like, a great place to rest, Polin. And Vilnius was known, of course, as the Jerusalem of Lithuania. So, people felt very, they felt a lot of love for this Central European bit of land. It's just a little picture there, what it was sort of like in a little Polish village. Okay, so all right, so let's just talk a little bit about the history before I talk about what it was like with the life there. So in 1569, remember I said to you we had this Union of Lublin. It happens through marriage, where Lithuania and Poland become joined, and when they join, we have this massive, you can see, massive country right in the middle of Central Europe. It is the biggest country in Central Europe. It includes what we know as Ukraine. It includes Poland and Belarus, Lithuania and Latvia, not Estonia. Or not really, Estonia, maybe parts of Estonia. But you can see this country is absolutely massive. It wields initially quite a bit of power, but you can imagine it's very difficult to control such a giant country. And this is where the problems really start to unravel this Commonwealth. But you can see it lasts for over 200 years, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and it lands up, which we'll speak about right near the end of the talk. It lands up being split into 3 different countries, and we don't have a Poland after then, or a Lithuania. It's gone. And is split between a number of countries. So that's what happens. I just thought I'd give you a little bit of the history. Now let's talk a little bit about what Jews did when they were in Poland. And basically, the community was governed by the Kahal. Okay, so we know, like now we talk about a kehila, like a little community. So the Kahal really was in charge of really what happened within the Jewish community, but more than that, it governs civil as well as religious activities, and so sort of there were Christians being run in the town, for example, by Christians, and Jews were ruled by Jews, and you'd go to a Jewish court if you needed to dispute something. It wasn't only religious matters, civil matters too, and of course taxes. The Kahal was responsible for getting money, but it was also responsible for shchita, and it was responsible for schooling, and it was responsible when schooling had, and the mikveh. And then of course you've got all these kahals, and each one was having arguments with the next one. So we have a very unique situation happening in Poland and Lithuania. We have this Council of 4 Lands which gets established. It's established in 1580. It's called Va'ad Arba Artsot, and the 4 lands are 4 parts of Poland, and including what we know, parts of the Ukraine. All the areas where Jews are living. So those are the 4 lands, and then Lithuania is added. So it's Va'ad Lita. So yeah, that's I think it's actually called Medinat Lita, the state of Lita. So yeah, so we've got really like an autonomous Jewish authority ruling Jewish life in a country that's ruled by a king, a non-Jewish king. But Jews are really governing themselves, and that's the beauty of being able to live in Poland and Lithuania is you honestly have this incredible autonomy and freedom. The Council of Four Lands gets stopped later on, and things actually when things are really unraveling for the Jewish community. But once it gets stopped, the community is completely unraveled and split up at that stage. What language did Jews speak? Well, we know that Jews spoke Yiddish. Yiddish for sure was the main language. Of course, some Jews spoke Polish, and some Jews also spoke German, and some Jews spoke Lithuanian if they lived in Lithuania. But in general, if you wanted to communicate with Jews, you would speak Yiddish. We spoke last week how Yiddish developed from High German, including Aramaic and including Hebrew, and also it also incorporates Slavic words, especially Eastern Yiddish. So they've become two forms of Yiddish: Western Yiddish and Eastern Yiddish. The majority of people in the world today that speak Yiddish are speaking the Eastern form of Yiddish, and of course that's including a lot of Slavic words because it comes from Poland and Ukraine and Lithuania. Okay, so yeah, books are also published in Yiddish and schools in Yiddish, and a lot of women are reading Yiddish as well. Important to know about the shtetl. I've got like a little picture here of like a little village. I mean, think of Fiddler on the Roof. That's your shtetl. So Jews tended to live in little villages. Of course, we'll talk later about the Pale of Settlement, but when they live in the Pale of Settlement, for sure, they're in these tiny little villages. Jews generally didn't live completely rural lives. They were not farmers. They were living in small towns and were mostly craftsmen or traders, or they were dealing in sometimes in money lending, but very much in land leasing, which we'll discuss also later. Land leasing to the peasants, innkeeping, alcohol trade, and just general sort of small trade as well. And they tended to live in these tiny towns. When they did live in a city, I mean, for sure there were Jews in Kovno, there were Jews in Vilna, and there were Jews in Krakow, and there were Jews in Warsaw, and there were definitely Jewish quarters in these cities, well, they're like towns, but they became cities. There were Jewish quarters, but Jews didn't have to live in the Jewish quarters. They chose to live in the Jewish quarters. Why did they live in the Jewish quarters? Because it was safer, firstly. And also, why do we choose to now live in a Jewish area? Because that's where the infrastructure is for Jews. So Jews had the same sort of choice there. They weren't restricted to living within a ghetto like they were in Western Europe. They could live wherever they wanted, but they tended to live in the Jewish quarter. And if they were in a more rural area, they were living in a shtetl. Okay, so important to know that the feudal system did exist in Poland, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as well. We discussed the feudal system last week, where you had like kings, and then you had barons and nobility, and then underneath there you've got serfs. And we said the Jews really didn't fit into the feudal system, and that was actually a lot of the problem in the Middle Ages. There was no one really protecting the Jews. The Jews were the chattel of the king. But in Poland and Lithuania, you've still got that feudal system pyramid where you've got the serfs at the bottom, and then you've got the nobility, and then you've got the king. But the interesting thing is, I'll just, oopsies, I'll just stop sharing for a moment. The interesting thing is that even though you have a feudal system, Jews sort of have a place in this feudal system. They don't fit into the pyramid, but they're very, very closely aligned with the nobility and with the barons and the heads, the owners of property. So Jews themselves were not nobility, not at all, and they were not serfs. So they didn't work on the land, but they were very, very closely connected. So they were part of that triangle, but they're like a tiny little attachment on the side of the triangle. And because of that little attachment, they didn't just have protection from the king, they also had protection from the nobility. It was like the nobility's responsibility to protect the Jews. The problem is then you've got this massive amount of serfs sitting at the bottom there, and because the Jews are the middlemen, that's going to put the Jews in a very, very precarious situation, and we're going to see that later. What happens to Jews being the middlemen? It's never, ever a safe place for Jews to be. Okay, so what else were Jews doing? Well, Jews like to study, and of course there were many yeshivas that started. Now, let's not get confused with the whole yeshiva system that then starts in Lithuania very much later. We'll talk about that as well. That's a whole movement that then starts in the early 1800s. But earlier than that, in the 1500s, we've got yeshivas that are actually starting in Poland, usually not Lithuania. So we always think of yeshivas in Lithuania, but in the early days, it's yeshivas in Poland. And whereas you were getting scholars coming from Germany to Poland to come and teach people, it starts being the reverse. People are learning more in Poland and are starting to shift over towards Germany to teach in German lands. So the center yeshivas are really starting in Poland, and we've got lots of yeshivas, especially in Krakow and Lublin. Our main, we have, I'll just mention some rabbis. Don't get confused, there'll be a lot of rabbis' names. So don't get too confused with rabbis' names. I'm going to see if I can share. That way, I might have some of them here. Let's get some. Here we go. Okay. So I've only written down the main ones that you'll remember because you've seen the pictures. But we need to also mention that there was a rabbi called Rabbi Yaakov Pollack. So Pollack, like from Poland, and he was a Polish-born Talmudic scholar who started the system called Pilpul. I don't know if you've heard of Pilpul, all of you, but it's a very sort of convoluted way of getting to a conclusion in Talmudic studies. So it would be like if A leads to B and B leads to C and C leads to D, then A leads to D. So you can get you might get the wrong conclusion, but it's really very good for your brain. And this became a very Polish way, a Polish yeshiva way of studying Torah and studying Talmud. Rabbi Pollack then has a disciple called Rabbi Shachna of Lublin. He starts the main yeshivas in Lublin. I've been to Lublin and I've seen where the Chachamei Lublin, where the main yeshiva there was insane, even now to see what it was, just before the Holocaust. Unfortunately, it all got destroyed. But Lublin was a huge center of learning, as was Krakow. And in Krakow, you get one of the most famous Polish, well, probably the most famous Polish rabbi is Rabbi Moshe Isserles, who we know as the Ramah. He had a yeshiva in Krakow, Krakow, it depends how you want to pronounce it. Basically, what he did was he took the Shulchan Aruch, which had been developed during his lifetime, and he layered on top of the Shulchan Aruch, because the Shulchan Aruch written by Rabbi Yosef Karo was really for Sfardim. And what he did was he layered on top of the Shulchan Aruch the Ashkenazi customs and ways of doing things. So by doing that, it allows Ashkenazim to read the Shulchan Aruch and to it all makes sense to Ashkenazim as well. And it makes it a universal code of law rather than saying, you know what, that's your code for Sfardim and we've got our own code for Ashkenazim and, we'll never the two shall meet. Instead of doing that, he was very humble. He had actually developed his own code before the Shulchan Aruch got published, but he didn't actually bring it to the fore. He just added tiny little bits onto the Shulchan Aruch. So those are for Ashkenazi customs, and he called his book Hamapah, so the tablecloth. So the Shulchan Aruch is the table, the set table, and Hamapah is the tablecloth that comes on top of the Shulchan Aruch. Very famous. I found this picture on the internet, a picture of his grave. I've been to his grave in Krakow. There are tons of people all the time visiting his grave in the Jewish cemetery actually, interestingly enough, not only Jews. Yes, as many of the cemeteries in Poland had lots of non-Jewish people visiting there. Okay. Ooh, everything comes to an end, right? Okay, so I'm going to talk now. We've done all the nice things in Poland and Lithuania, and the bad stuff starts. So very important. I'm just going to go back. I'm going to stop sharing for a second and talk to you a little bit. Okay, so remember we spoke about the feudal system. Remember we spoke about the land leasing. So I'm just going to get into a little bit more detail because we have to understand that very carefully to understand how the Khmelnytsky massacres happen. The Khmelnytsky massacres are the end, pretty much, of wonderful life in Poland. It's when people start going, Poland, like here we will rest and reside. So, Jews being traders and also being good businessmen and also being close to the nobility were often living in the frontiers. So when Poland expanded and took parts of the Ukraine and then more and more and more the Ukraine and Belarus, when it expanded, Jews were often living in those frontier towns. In fact, most of those frontier towns were populated, like was majority Jewish. And they had inns and they had taverns and whatever. And they leased the land from the Polish nobles, and this was called the arenda system. The Polish nobility owned huge tracts of land, like massive tracts of land in Ukraine, and this was called latifundia. I'm giving you lots of words. Okay. So latifundia, big pieces of land, and the arenda system is this land lease system. So Jews would lease the land, and then they would have to like make sure that everything worked well on the land, including being in charge of the serfs that were on the land. Now, if the serfs were poor, right, they had hardly any money, and they're working for the nobility. And if you're a serf and you're very poor and you work for the nobility, and the Jews are the ones that are coming to say, look, I need your rent, I need your taxes, you need to pay us to go on this bridge. If you want to farm, if you want to fish in that fish pond, you have to pay us. Because this is how Jews made money, is basically they took over the lease and then they got whatever profit in excess of what they had to pay to the nobility. So the nobility basically had the Jews in a vice, because they would say, look, this year you need to accumulate on this piece of land, let's say 3,000 zlotys. So it was very difficult to get those 3,000 zlotys. But if the Jews made 3,500 zlotys, then they could get 500 zlotys. So this is pretty much how you made money in the arenda system. But if you're a peasant and working on the land and you're poor and you have absolutely nothing at all, and the Jews all the time demanding everything of you, the one you're not going to like is the Jew. It's not so much the Polish nobility that's making the Jew do all of this. That's the person you don't like. It's like your landlord, right? The person that's coming to get rent from you is the person you don't like. You don't actually know who owns your apartment or who owns your house, but the Jew is the one getting the rent. So they were the ones that got the flack, and the serfs were angry. The other problem was that the Polish nobility, or Poland was really a Catholic country, and the people in Ukraine, who were like the serfs, the peasants, they were mostly Russian Orthodox. And there was a lot of animosity between Russian Orthodox and Catholics. And they felt all the time that the Catholics were trying to convert them. And, you know, into this big country that was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was a Catholic country. And of course the serfs were, you know, Russian Orthodox. So there was a religious problem, there was a financial problem, and Jews didn't have, you know, they weren't friends with the serfs, they were like their landlords, right? So there wasn't a lot of, like, you know, good communication between the two. So when you get this like massive group of people that are angry and need to vent out, when they have a strong leader, like a man like Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who got all of them together and said, all right, let's go and let's just kill the Jews. and then we won't have to pay our rent anymore. So they didn't just kill Jews. Of course, they killed, well, they tried to kill nobility as well, but you know, the nobility weren't there on the ground. The Jews were there on the ground. So they definitely got you know, Catholic clergy. They got Jews. They did get nobility as well, because these massacres that went from 1648 to 1649, and actually all the way through to 1651, and even 1653, depending on how you look at it, they ultimately go, you know, the whole of of Ukraine into southern Poland. They even make it up north to Lithuania, and massacres on a gigantic scale. We didn't see anything like those massacres until the Holocaust. It was massacres on a similar sort of scale. I'm not going to talk about them, but you can look up stuff. Horrific, like properly horrific. And so you've got Jews on the run. They had to leave their towns. Very often the towns were, you know, they made a ring around the towns so the Jews couldn't get out. They tried to take refuge in some of the castles that were owned by nobility. The nobility often took them in, but then they were also killed, you know, by the hordes that were trying to kill them as well. It's very hard to actually imagine, but imagine rioters running wild, absolutely wild, and just like, you know, indiscriminate killing and murder all around. And so Jews trying to move from town to town to town, trying to find refuge. Jewish communities were completely disrupted. So that whole kahila idea, kahal, like gone. Towns on the southern flank, on that southern border, like decimated. And the structure of life changes forever in Poland. It will never be the same, and Lithuania. It will never be the same, and Jews will never forget those years. We call those years Tach B'Tat, and that's 1648, 1649, the Tach B'Tat massacres, the Bogdan Khmelnytsky massacres. Sadly, Khmelnytsky is actually a Ukrainian hero. They still consider him a hero. There's statues to him in Ukraine, and you know, because he sort of rescued the serfs, I guess, and tried to get rid of the Polish nobility. But for Jews, he was, you know, he was like Hitler ymach shemo, so terrible man for Jews. And so we get a whole restructuring of the Jewish communities after then, and this actually changes Jewish life dramatically, and has implications and repercussions for many, many, many things that then start to happen. I'm going to start sharing the screen if I can. Okay, share. Okay, so that's Tach B'Tat. Now, okay, so all around the world, the Jewish world, people are now in shock. They've heard about these Tach B'Tat massacres. They can't believe it's happened. Actually in the year, so they thought 1648 was supposed to be, like the Kabbalists had calculated, it was supposed to be the year that Mashiach came. And so like the Jews were sort of ripe for redemption, and then this happened. And you can imagine what it was like around the Jewish world. People were in shock and disbelief. And so unfortunately, false messiahs make have had a presence in Jewish history for a long time. But there's a series of false messiahs that then come, the biggest one being Shabtai Tzvi, because this totally disrupts the Jewish community around the world. It changes how Jewish people think around the world, and it ultimately leads to many, many events, like entire chains of events that then happen for the next, hundreds of years after Shabtai Tzvi. So I'll tell you a little bit about this man called Shabtai Tzvi. So he was born on the 9th of Av, right? He's born on Tisha B'Av in Smyrna or Izmir in the Ottoman Empire. He was a very talented student from a very young age, very smart. People thought he was definitely destined for the rabbinate. But then they started to realize that he was a bit strange. And he actually landed up flouting a whole bunch of halachot and being very public about flouting these halachot. And he lands up being banned by the rabbis of Smyrna, who get rid of him. And he goes from place to place. It's very charismatic. And definitely now we know with Shabtai Tzvi that he had a bipolar psychosis. So we know that he was very mentally unstable. But in the Middle Ages, or certainly in this period, people didn't totally understand psychosis. Sometimes they thought that person was very unusual, but actually extremely holy. So even though he was very charismatic, he got banned in most of the places that he went to because people realized actually he is much more strange than he is holy. Anyway, he manages to get to Israel, and he meets a man there called Nathan of Gaza. And Nathan of Gaza is a very highly respected, he's a highly respected man. He is considered a scholar, very good scholar. And Shabtai Tzvi goes to visit him, and Nathan of Gaza says to him, you know what, all the things you're telling me, you are the Messiah. And he goes, well, I must be then. So he then thinks he is the Messiah. And because he is so charismatic, and because Nathan of Gaza has got so much influence, the word spreads extremely quickly for this era. It's not on the internet, but word spreads very quickly all around the world, all around the Jewish world, that Mashiach has come. So even though there were many very skeptical rabbis who said, seriously, this is not Mashiach, they got shut down by the mobs of Jews around them who said, we've got Mashiach coming. And they had to be very careful about what they said, because people honestly believed that Mashiach had come. And they, including selling their houses, preparing to go to the land of Israel, telling all their Christian neighbors that the Mashiach had come. And so they were, taunting their Christian neighbors, basically, because now Mashiach had come and everything that we've been hoping for is happening. People have gone crazy, but it was like mass frenzy, surrounding Shabtai Tzvi. What actually happens is Shabtai Tzvi, he eventually gets back to the Ottoman Empire, and the Sultan hears of him, and he's telling everyone that he's going to take Jerusalem back from the Sultan, and because he's Mashiach. He, at the same time, he's banned a whole bunch of laws. Like he said that, no Tisha B'Av, no 17th of Tammuz anymore. We don't need that. He changed. He obviously flouted kashrut laws in front of everyone and told them also to do that. People believed him, except the Sultan. So the Sultan captures him basically and says, "Okay, well, I'm going to give you two choices. Either you convert to Islam, or you die." And he says, "Okay, I'll convert to Islam." So he converts. The people that people thought was the Mashiach converts to Islam in 1666, and he becomes a Muslim. Becomes Muslim. His name is Aziz Mehmed Effendi, and people are still believing that maybe he is Mashiach, and this is like what he's supposed to do in the pre-steps towards the ultimate redemption. They couldn't let it go that he was not Mashiach for a long time. So there was one group. Other groups were so devastated with what had happened that they just lost faith completely in Judaism. And there were other groups that then turned inwards. So inwards on themselves, anybody who appeared to be having any sort of, anything unusual or promoting Kabbalah, even if they were like really very pious and very real and very true, and it was the truth that they were saying, those people were often not believed by the rabbinites, because now they didn't trust anybody because of what had happened with Shabtai Tzvi. So it has huge ramifications for many Jews. In fact, all the machlokas that then happens following this between rabbis and between communities, a lot of it is to do with, was the person a Sabbatean? And this goes on for years, where people are accused of being Sabbateans. And a Sabbatean really is a believer in Shabtai Tzvi. Okay, now we'll look at the next section, which is what happened in Poland, because now they've just had the Tach massacres. They've had the story of Shabtai Tzvi. They know that Shabtai Tzvi is not Mashiach. And they're very, very disillusioned. The Jews living in the Ukraine, so this is Ukraine is huge, and part of what are now Ukraine was actually proper Poland then, like Galicia and those areas. But down in the sort of the real eastern parts of the Ukraine, Jews were very, very poor, very disillusioned, very unlearned, and sort of the rabbis of the time were basically appointed if they could pay for the role. So it didn't matter if you were a good rabbi or a bad rabbi. If you could pay for the role of being a rabbi, then you were the rabbi. And so people just didn't have good rabbis, and they sort of lost faith in their rabbis. And it was, I guess, ripe for something new. So again, this is a time when new people are thinking new ideas. It's the end of the 1600s. Around the world, there are new ideas happening. We've got the Enlightenment happening in Western Europe at this time. And of course, there's new ideas happening in southern Poland, Ukraine as well. And we have the rise of Hasidus. So Hasidism, Hasidut, however you want to call it, it begins with a man called the Baal Shem Tov. We don't have a real picture of the Baal Shem Tov. I've got this picture, but I don't think it's really what the Baal Shem Tov necessarily looked like. The Baal Shem Tov Rabbi Yisrael ben Eliezer, born on the 18th of Elul in 1698. And in the Polish, so it's still Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, it's not called Ukraine, but it's in the Polish province of Podolia. Podolia then becomes Ukraine. And it was a very poor area. He was called a Baal Shem. A Baal Shem was actually a master of the holy name. So he had talismans, and he sold them, and he was known as a holy man. But essentially, he was a laborer. So he was working, laboring very, very, very hard. He was orphaned at a very, very young age, and he was a very charismatic speaker. People were absolutely drawn to him, and he developed this concept of Hasidism, where there should be joy in worship, where you should be close to Hashem in all ways. And it didn't really matter if you sat studying in yeshiva all day. You could be a poor person with very little learning, but you could still be close to Hashem. So spirituality was everything for him, and it was all about prayer and becoming and joy and spiritual elevation through prayer. And he appealed to the masses, and he started, people started to flock to him He himself, I guess, never really saw the fruits of what he initially created, but he had a disciple called Rabbi Dov Ber. He is the Maggid of Mezerich, and Dov Ber then is the one that teaches all the next generation of leaders, and all these leaders become Hasidic dynasties in themselves, and they create Hasidism as we know today, where you have a Rebbe and a huge following that's following that particular Rebbe. And each branch of Hasidism really is slightly different. They're going to have, some are going to place more emphasis on learning, some are going to place more emphasis on prayer, some more on spirituality, some more on Kabbalah. So it just depends on where the dynasty sort of went as to what became of their followers. Did Hasidism get to Lithuania? Yes, absolutely. There was Hasidism in Lithuania, but I'm going to tell you about what happens next, how it gets halted in Lithuania. But really, it takes over. It takes over the masses in Poland and in Ukraine, and certainly southern Lithuania as well, and even parts of Belarus become heavily Hasidic. That's at the bottom there. That's a picture of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who is the founder of the Chabad movement. Where Chabad is very big in Australia and Melbourne, where we live. But yeah, it's now probably one of the biggest Hasidic movements. But it's actually really developed in Lithuania, and so it's quite different from some of the other forms of Hasidism, and it's sort of more lit back than other forms of Hasidism, which may have moved down further south and even into Hungary. All right, let's look here, because I'll talk very quickly here. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about Lithuania. So I mean, the majority of South Africans, I'm presuming, are from Lithuania. I know my family is mostly from Lithuania, and every South African I've met here is really telling me that their origins are Lithuanian. So we have to learn about the Vilna Gaon, because if you are of Lithuanian origin, you must know as much as possible about the Vilna Gaon. He was a genius of note, Rabbi Eliyahu of Vilna. He's born in 720 to 797. So you can see he overlaps the period where the Baal Shem Tov is, and of course Rabbi Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezerich, and even Shneur Zalman of Liadi, and they come to there's a lot of conflict between Hasidism and the followers of the Vilna Gaon, who are called the Misnagdim. So Misnagdim is not such a nice word, like we call ourselves Misnagdim or Misnagdim, but it means opponents. So the Misnagdim were the followers of the Vilna Gaon who opposed Hasidism, and the opposition got very on both sides, got very bad. They would really insult each other very badly, and often called in the Russian government to intervene, which is never a good thing ever. But so the Misnagdim and Hasidim unfortunately fought out their battles for a long time until they decided that there was another threat, and the other threat was actually coming from the Haskalah, from the secular enlightenment that had traveled from the west to the east, and that was much more of a threat to religious Judaism than each of them were to each other. They actually realized they had much more in common than they actually thought that they did. But the Vilna Gaon, of course, very respected leader, undisputed leader of Jews in Lithuania during his lifetime. He never had He never had a shul or a community of his own or a yeshiva of his own, but he was the undisputed leader. The reason was, unlike the Baal Shem Tov, who was very charismatic and spoke, volumes, he was a very quiet man who was very closed. He was very private, didn't hold big audiences, but extremely, extremely, extremely learned. So, if anyone had a question about anything, he was the go-to person. He managed to correct all sorts of errors that had got into the Talmud over the years due to copying errors. He managed to fix it. I mean, he was so brilliant that he managed to do all of this without much school education either, and without much yeshiva education. He did it all himself. He didn't need a teacher. He also, lived very, very frugally, believed that every second of one's day should be spent studying Torah. He got very little sleep, very little sleep, and the only time not spent studying Torah was, in the bathroom. So basically, he felt that every second of the day should be spent delving into Torah. We know that he understood maths and he understood science, and he was very astute in his knowledge of that. But whether he actually had done secular learning, we don't know, because he placed so much emphasis on Torah learning. Very, very, I could do a whole talk on the Vilna Gaon, but I have 3 minutes to talk about the Vilna Gaon. So I'm going to move on. Please do look him up. There's tons of information that you can find on the Vilna Gaon. We're just going to look now at the yeshiva movement that really follows in Lithuania because of the Vilna Gaon. So at the time that the Gaon was the head of the community, he realized that learning in Lithuania had actually gone really downhill. So people were not learned. The communities had suffered terribly after Tach B'Tat. People were poor and unlearned. And he realized that they really needed to establish a whole new system of learning where young boys would be able to go to a yeshiva. They'd be able to elevate themselves spiritually, but not only spiritually. Like, you could be a very poor boy, but you could be a genius, and then you could go to yeshiva and you could actually end up marrying very well, because of course everyone wanted their daughters to marry, Talmid Chachamim. So you could elevate yourself by learning Torah, and also he realized that there was really a desperate need in Lithuania for learning. So when we think of Lithuania as the place where the really learned people were, it wasn't until the 1800s that Lithuania was a learned place. Before then, people were generally pretty unlearned compared to Poland. But this yeshiva system starts thanks to the Vilna Gaon, and then of course to a man called Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, who starts the yeshiva system. He starts with his own yeshiva in Volozhin and attracts hundreds of young boys and young men to come and learn in the yeshiva, and that becomes the model for all the other yeshivas that follow. I'll mention some of the names, but you would have heard them for sure. Mir, Tels, Kelem, Slobodka, and Ponovich. These are all names that we grew up knowing, that we grew up hearing, and famous yeshivas that attracted really among them thousands of scholars. Also very important in Lithuania was the Musa movement, which was started by Rabbi Yisrael Salanta, 1810 to 1883. He had his own yeshiva at Slobodka. And of course the Chafetz Chaim, who followed this Musa movement as well. We always hear about the Chafetz Chaim still today. He had his own yeshiva in Radin. The Musa movement, of course, was very much looking at building your own ethics, building yourself to be spiritually higher, to be very modest, to be less materialistic, and to be able to I mean, again, you could do a whole talk on this, but just it was, instead of just looking at the, you know, at how much Torah you were learning, they said you've also got to look at the person. You have to look at how spiritual and how ethical and how good the person is. You have to really develop your midot, not only learn Torah, but of course his students did learn Torah and they worked on midot. Okay, so then what happens to Poland? I've got like a few minutes to tell you what happens to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was this country that went for, you know, 200 and something years. Unfortunately, it was weak, right? It was so big and everyone wanted a piece of it. We have Russia on the east, who was constantly fighting wars with Poland and with Lithuania. You've got Prussia on the west, again, had real designs on Poland, and Austria down south, which wanted Poland too. So between Germany, Prussia, so Germany wasn't a big, you know, a whole unified country yet. Between Prussia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Russia, they broke up Poland between themselves, and until there was no Poland or Lithuania left, or Ukraine. It started, you can see this one over here, in 1772. Poland is purple, if you look at that map. So they broke off parts of Poland. It's in these areas around here, like where the borders are. Russia takes that, Austria takes Galicia, and you know, Prussia takes Silesia, and then they start taking more. It's not enough for them. So 20 years later, they want more, and Poland's now this like little thin country in the middle. Poland, Lithuania, and by 1795, there's none of Poland left. And you know, how you landed up in the Jewish community really depended on where you were. So if you landed up being taken over by Prussia, then most likely you were in a decent position because the Enlightenment had come to the West. By that stage, Jews were already almost at the stage of getting, you know, citizenship and emancipation. The enlightened despots of all those three countries had designs of what they wanted to do with their Jews. So Prussia really wanted to make their Jews useful citizens, and so went about trying to secularize them and trying to get them very included in Prussian life. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, if you happen to be living in Galicia, in places like Lvov, then you were taken over by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They also were, you know, much more. They developed the towns. They made Jewish life much better there than it was if you were living under Russian rule. And of course, many Jews went to, you know, became very much part of the Austro-Hungarian life structure. They fought in the army, but, you know, sort of proud soldiers in the army. Whereas Russia, unfortunately, if you were taken over by Russia, Russia hadn't had Jews living there, you know, at all since the 1400s. They didn't know what to do with Jews, and so Catherine the Great basically said, well, look, there's a whole bunch of Jews living here. We don't want them. So we're going to confine them into an area. They can't come into Russia proper. They have to live in this area called the Pale of Settlement. And she literally confined Jews to living in this area. You couldn't live rurally. You had to live in a shtetl. You couldn't live in certain towns, but you could live in others. You couldn't have certain professions. She could move you around at will. There were constant pogroms in the Pale. There was compulsory conscription to the Russian army, sometimes for 25 years. Those were those awful Cantonist laws. I'm going to stop sharing because now you've seen the Pale. Oh, you can see if you look over here that it ends over here with Kovna. So this is of course, Lithuania is very much in the Pale. as is most of Poland and Ukraine in the Pale, but Latvia is mostly not in the Pale. Okay, Latvia, because I'm sure there's a few Latvian descendants there as well. So Latvia was Courland and also Latgalia, Livonia. So Latgalia became part of the Pale. Courland and Livonia never, if people from Riga, they were not in the Pale of settlement. But those people that were from Vilna, from Kovna, and from Belarus, they were all in the Pale. And terrible life in the Pale. Terrible, terrible. Poverty-stricken, pogroms, and cantonist law, which meant recruitment to the army, sometimes for 25 years, and that was the end of your Judaism. If you even made it out alive, you didn't make it out Jewish. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second here. So we've got the Pale of Settlement, which means that Jews were living a miserable life in the Pale and needed to move. In fact, Russia was quite happy to get them to move. And so literally millions of Jews moved out of the Pale of Settlement in the late 1800s and moved west. So we've got Jews that are moving, back to the traditional Ashkenazi land, back to Germany, back to France. We've got Jews moving to America. We've got Jews moving to South Africa. We've got Jews moving to Australia and to South America. So next week, we're going to talk about those movements back west. What happened in the West at the time, and what forced these movements, and what it was like living in the West. And so we're going to talk about the Enlightenment, the Haskalah. It's a very interesting period as well, and that leads on to the modern period. I haven't touched tonight what happened in the Shoah, what happened in the Holocaust, because there's a whole other history that then happens from I've sort of finished off here in the early 1800s or mid 1800s. There's another entire history that then happens until 1939 and 1940. If you want at some stage, I'm very happy to do a further history of Lithuania and Latvia. I've just spoken to the rabbi here in Melbourne. They want me to do a talk here, so I'm happy to do it in time if you're interested in knowing what happens following this partition and the Pale of Settlement. But hopefully see you next week to learn about what happens on the journey west. If anyone has any questions that they want to ask.
Thank you so much once again. I just want to raise just to speak about a couple of comments that came in on the comments. Adele just mentioned that they just minted a coin in Lithuania to commemorate the Vilna Gaon's birth. So
that's right.
Really interesting.
That's right. This year was actually supposed to be in Lithuania, which is actually fairly can be quite anti-Semitic and all sorts of problems now in Lithuania. But interestingly enough, Lithuania this year made it the year of the Vilna Gaon, which is amazing. And they actually put out a lot of information. If you go on Google and you look up Vilna Gaon, you'll actually find a lot of sites coming from the Lithuanian government, sites on the Vilna Gaon, and good sites actually on his life.
And then the other Ari asks the question, and I'll just read it as it comes through. How come in all the times mentioned in your talks, there is no mention of any one woman who played a role in the Jewish community of those times?
Yes. Well, it would have been nice if there were women mentioned throughout history. So, of course, women are playing a very active role in Jewish history, but of course we don't know too much about many of them. There are definitely some women that stand out that are famous that we know of, but actually in Poland, Lithuania, there's maybe one or two that sort of stand out as being as even having any information written about them. Unfortunately, in the when you're talking Middle Ages and you're talking even early Renaissance period all the way until the Haskalah, we're going to get very little information about women because women were unfortunately, women were not the leaders of the community, or not not in positions of power. We know that we're in positions of power within the family, but not necessarily within the community. Certainly not in the East. Well, I did a talk a number of months ago here in Melbourne, not on Ashkenazi history, but on Sephardi history, and actually that we did a whole section on Donna Grazia. You could do an entire talk on Donna Grazia Mendes, because there's a lot of information written about her, very famous woman. But certainly in Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, you're not getting a lot of historical information about women, sadly so.
Eva, I guess it also has to
There
do
were women, for sure.
I guess also about the fact.
Mostly the women worked very hard, like the Vilna Gaon and the Hofetzchaim. Their wives had little shops, and they looked after their husbands, and they cooked and cleaned and had the babies. Those women were really the backbone of these great men. Even the Chazan Isha's mother, Rasha Leah, they say she negel-vased him from when he was a few months old. So there were some very holy mothers behind these Goanim and people that we venerate.
So basically nothing's changed, right? Behind every great man.
Is a very great woman.
Yeah. But I guess also Bev, but I suppose we also have to do...
I was going to say, we just don't have too much historic information about them. Not much was written about women then. But, as we get into modernity, we see much more written about women.
Yeah.
But even then, we don't. Last week I mentioned Rashi's daughter. But there's books now written about Rashi's daughters, but a lot of it is surmising the information. It's not based on any written documentation that we have on Rashi's daughters. Very little there.
I know it's very late now in Melbourne time, but if there's maybe one or two more questions, if anyone wants to just unmute and please ask. Okay, great, Bev. I think you've covered it all once again, and just thank you so much for your time, and certainly once again the passion certainly comes through over the screen. I'm sure in person it would be even more dynamic. Please God, maybe there'll be such a time, but we certainly look forward to next week's talk, and the fact that you've already opened yourself up for a follow-up invitation. I know I already had someone privately message me here to say, can there possibly be a talk about Lithuanian Jews coming to South Africa? But please God, we'll be in touch with you in the future. And on behalf of everyone, I'm sure just a huge thank you again for your time. And we so look forward to next week. Norman's giving a clap. I'm sure everyone's giving a round of applause as well. So thank you so much, babe. We look forward to next week.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Looking forward to next week too.
Bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye, everyone. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.